All right. Hi. Thank you so much for joining in. Welcome to EIV webinar on decoding, monitoring and evaluation for volunteering programs. We have Yashaswini here with us from UNI. Yashaswini has been with UNI for 10 years. She started as a volunteer, then moved on to do her master's from this in social innovation and entrepreneurship. She then came back as a teach manager. She did work with some different organizations where she learned about monitoring and evaluation, program design, and figured that now that she has volunteered with UNI, she understands the program and would want to do something similar in UNI as well. She joined as a teach manager, but she's very passionate about program design and intervention design. And that's why she's here to talk about how she has explored or evolved the M&E at UNI. Thank you, Yashaswini, for joining us. Over to you. Please share the screen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, let me know when you can.
Screen's visible, yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so just to get a sense check, how many of us know what M&E is? I think a few people were asking what is M&E and what are we going to talk about today. So, and the other thing is I will need you all to use the chat box quite a bit because I don't want to feel like I'm talking to myself. So just help me out there. Can I get some people reply on the chat? Do you all know what M&E is? Where are we with M&E? Can I get some thumbs up if you know? Cool. All right, I'm going to proceed. So just to make this a little bit more interactive for all of us, I've placed this bell icon sort of insert.
Can't hear you, Yashaswini. Not audible.
No, we
yet.
can't hear you.
Yeah.
No, I think it's the Bluetooth connection, maybe.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So what I was saying is, so whenever you see the bell icon, it's your cue to use the chat box to either ask a question or to answer a question that I have asked. I am going to ask a lot of questions. I want to have conversations. And also use the Zoom reactions just to make it interactive. It will help me stay on track. Cool. So I think what we are going to be talking about for the next 20 minutes and then spend a lot of time doing Q&A. I think someone's. Okay, so what we'll be talking about are a few aspects, but I will be using a lot of UNI context just to make it more relatable. And the other thing is a lot of resources available online for you to go and read. And I'm sure there are some of us here who are probably into M&E a lot longer than I am. There might be people who are just starting off. There might be people who are trying to understand how to manage volunteering programs. So just, to bring everyone together and something that's each one of you will be able to take away. We're going to talk about these things, key components in terms of what do I use for UNI, and some major challenges we face with M&E, and M&E can be fairly challenging. And what are some best practices or some insights that we've been able to pick up from the, at least the last 4 years of me trying to figure out M&E. Yeah, are you all with me? Yes. Okay, so just for you to understand what do as an organization we do, UNI, and what is our reach so that you understand the scale at which we do M&E. So the last academic year, we've had around 2,309 students who we have actively worked with. About 2,700 to 3,000 volunteers. So in UNI, we follow a 1:1 ratio between the student and the volunteers. We have about 121 learning centers and 39 cities, which eventually we've been expanding. And this year we will be reaching 45 cities across India. So this is the scale at which we do M&E. We are an after-school program. We are heavily based on volunteering. As I said, we are a 1:1 ratio that we follow. And the curriculum that we deliver is mostly foundational literacy, like basic English skills, numeracy, and life skills. We also have a program that, is a mentoring program for students at a little bit more at an age where they're trying to get an understanding of what career to find. So that is our program. And if you do have questions about it, you'd like to get more clarity on some aspect, do use the chat box. So I think with monitoring and evaluation for any program, one thing that is extremely important, and in UNI something that we really value, is to understand the constraints that we have as a program, right? And I'm sure a lot of you will relate to the fact that when you're having a volunteering program, the number of hours that you get with your volunteers are very limited. So we run a program where we are able to spend, say, 3 hours or 4 hours per week with the students, and the volunteers are also spending the same amount of time because we're an after-school program. And with this time duration, then the contact hours is quite less, right? And there are a lot of priorities that volunteers need to cater to during this 4 hours. Second thing that we need to keep in mind is we can't do extensive training and extensive capacity building with our volunteers. And the need is to be able to coach and mentor volunteers enough to create impact. And I'm sure the others in the room who are in the M&E space, I'm sure that it's a skill, like data might take hours of upskilling for a person, but the M&E design has to be based on the fact that we get very limited time with our volunteers and we can't spend a lot of time upskilling. So keeping these two sort of constraints in mind, some values that we make sure that we follow while designing a monitoring and evaluation system is less is more. I think the lesser the amount of data we collect and more that we use that data, it really helps, right? And the quicker the collection process is, it's easier for anybody to use it. And the room for error, a lot of times when we use, I don't know if you people have seen this, but for me, when I use sheets, a lot of times data can get misplaced. If you by mistake click on another cell and then you're typing something else, then it can get misplaced. So it's also important to think about how we can reduce the number of possibility of error by collecting the data. And the third thing is, how can we complete the feedback loop? If we are collecting data, how can we also end that loop by making use of that data? And I think the fourth thing, which is related to the limited time constraint, is can we make it self-explanatory? And for example, like attendance data, right, that we collect, it's self-explanatory. We don't need to explain what is attendance and why people, you collect it. So that's sort of. Now, understanding the constraints and building an M&E plan around it is an ongoing process. And year we evolve and we try to make it better every year. And our understanding of the constraint also gets better and better, go in depth with our understanding. So it's a process. But I think what we've been able to arrive at are majorly these 5 steps, or these 5 key components of right from setting a goal to figuring out how do I track that goal, and then what are the data points that I need to collect to track that goal, and how can I analyze that data and use that data. So it's an entire loop. So, and what I will be doing for the next, say, 5 to 7 minutes is sort of going into each of these steps and giving you examples of how we do it in UNI, because a lot of these things, you will get a lot of theoretical information that you can, get out of Google and research papers and read. But I thought it'd be interesting to see how we do it in UNI. I will also show you some examples of how we used to do it a few years ago and how we are doing it. Yeah. Cool. So the first thing is setting goals. I think a lot of times when you open a M&E manual or a guide, a lot of times it starts with the word theory of change or a logical framework. I'm not sure if all of you have seen it, but a lot of these content, it starts with that. I think initially, like 4 years back, when I started like thinking about designing an M&E plan, that's the first thought process that we also went into. Like, can we create an M&E? But it can be complicated. It can be, difficult to arrive at as a first thing to do. So even SMART goals, I'm sure a lot of you use SMART goals, and even OKRs. OKRs are objectives and key results. Even a checklist for that matter, it's great if you have a logical framework, but if you don't, even having SMART goals and OKRs really help. And when I'm saying OKRs or SMART goals, what I really mean is having a sort of a timeline or a key milestone saying, okay, by the end of this academic year, we should be able to increase the foundational literacy in kids. That is one example for a goal. So every program has a goal, and if your program is purely based on volunteering, then even that could be a goal. It could even be quantitative, like increasing the number of volunteers in your program for a year. But I think the key thing to keep in mind, and that really helps for me, and please use the chat box to put things that helps for you in this process. What helps for me is to make sure goals are set in a way that it helps us focus our effort as a program. So know exactly what to put effort into. Second, something that we can track progress and assess the progress, the quality of progress also. So I think a few examples of how we have done it a couple of years ago in UNI and where the direction we're moving towards is one example of SMART goals. And I'm not sure if you can read the text, but one of the goals here is increase in foundational English, which I just spoke about. There's increase in, a sustainable community, sustainable volunteering community. This could be also a goal. Now, the direction to which we are moving as a program is, we call it a playbook, wherein we are able to set OKRs, like objectives, and key results for those objectives and the deliverables for those objectives on a season basis. In UNI, we call it season, but it's, I think, very similar to quarters, what you can call it as quarters. You have your quarter one, quarter two. So we also divide the program into 4 seasons because we're an academic year related program. But what you can see is recruiting and selecting volunteers is one of our key objectives at the beginning of the year. And some of the key results are to, recruit 1:1 ratio, like I mentioned, to reduce the turnaround time between stages of screening and to give them a good experience. So this is an example of how we do goal setting. The second, and I've felt like a lot of difficulty in developing indicators, at least in the initial few years. Developing indicators has always been a challenge. And my personal struggle has been to identify indicators that can, be measured. Because a lot of times with the kind of projects that we work with, it can be very qualitative in nature and become very difficult to actually measure it. Like, for example, the behavior change in a child can be very difficult and tricky to measure, right? So please do share in the chat box if you face any other specific difficulties in this stage. So I think what's helped us is to just identify and segregate two things: all the quantitative, numerical, output related indicators, and more qualitative indicators. And quantitative indicators, like I've mentioned on the slide, it could be the number of beneficiaries, it could be the number of volunteers, it could be the number of hours that you conduct class, it could be attendance percentage, it could be all of these things. But qualitatively, like behavior, and the other things is change in attitude, it could be change in or satisfaction with the program. I'm sure a lot of you run volunteering programs, so one thing is capturing or getting their feedback end of the year and saying, okay, how was your volunteering experience? What was the impact of you volunteer? So I think, again, three key things that really works for me, and do share what works for you, is to make sure that it's measurable. Second, it's valid and reliable. A lot of times when we use interviews, when we use other methods to collect data, sometimes it cannot, that reliability may not be very high. So that also kind of becomes tricky. Like a parameter like attendance is reliable because there's somebody who is checking, okay, this person is in class and giving you attendance. Sensitive to change, I think, is something that I think with time I've realized is, while deciding indicators, it's also very important to check if they are sensitive to the change that happens during the time frame that you have decided. And for example, if you have an assessment, like we have assessments for our students, and if the assessment is not a tool that can help you understand the increase in knowledge throughout the year, then it can be very difficult. Right? And what I mean by it is, the assessment tool should be designed in such a way that it's easy to use repeatedly throughout the year. So if there's a student who, is in, say, level 1 and moves to level 2 in the middle of the year, that should also be possible to track. So I think some examples how we do it. The first picture that you
There are
see
some
is
questions in chat also, Yashaswini, if you can look at and then also.
All right. All right, can I come to the questions towards the end? Yeah, I think a lot of questions are related to volunteer engagement, and this screenshot that you see here is one related to that. So the first screenshot that you see is like a logical framework, a version of a logical framework for our program. And one thing that you see in outcomes are the qualitative indicators, and qualitative indicators are a lot to do with the satisfaction of their experience with UNI. And the screenshot that you see here is a net promoter score. So when, I'm sure all of you would have seen this in either your Swiggy orders or your Ola orders, where they ask you, would you recommend this to your friend, or how satisfied were you with this experience? So that sort of a score, or that sort of a mechanism we use, and this is a screenshot of our current NPS with our volunteers. So about like 780, 790 people have rated us these scores. So it's our way of measuring that how engaged our volunteers are and how satisfied they are at the end of the year. And this is collected through a feedback. Yeah. I think the third and the most challenging, I think these are the first two steps are at least something that you can travel, because as a person designing the program or designing M&E is something that you can think through and do. But the third thing is where it gets very challenging, because you're dependent on volunteers, or you're dependent on people implementing on the ground to give you the data. At least that's the most challenging for us. So can I get some reactions if it is challenging for you as well? Yeah.
We yesterday also asked people on how frequently do they collect data, Yashaswini, on do they only collect data once? What sort of data do they collect? So
Yeah.
with your conversation, if you can also talk about how frequently does UNI team collect data? I don't know how difficult it is for people to collect data, but I know that for
Yeah.
me, it's also very difficult to collect data just to get people to register.
Sure. I think what we do in UNI is while collecting data, we make sure that we have some filters in mind. That is, who is collecting the data and what kind of actions do we want them to take with the data that they collect. So, for example, if we are asking a volunteer to collect data, who is, the person teaching a student, then what kind of data do we need to ask the volunteer? First question. Second, what can the volunteer do with that data? So when we ask those questions, we arrive at the most minimum amount of data required, and the frequency is decided based on when do you want that action to be taken. So for example, something like I'm using assessments because it's easy to relate to. Something like assessments, we do it 3 times in a year. So we do it at the beginning of the year, middle of the year, and end of the year. But if a volunteer notices tremendous amount of change in a student, then even between assessment cycles, they can take an assessment. And that's where we need to smartly develop the assessment tool in a way that it doesn't take a long time to, conduct an assessment, but it's a quick assessment. We are currently trying out an assessment tool that should take us roughly 5 minutes per student. So we at the beginning, when we used to have assessment tools, it used to take about 15-20 minutes or maybe even an hour. But now we have arrived at a place where we're trying to reduce the time taken. And like I've written here, it should be easy to understand also. I think just to give you all an understanding, this can be done even on Google Sheets, like the most simplest platform, or Excel. But this can also be done on, a more tech-enabled platforms. And we use something called Campus Cloud developed by Commons. And that's the screenshot of how we take attendance in class. And the screenshot next to it is something called a walkthrough, wherein it's an observational checklist. So we go through class, and a leader who's also a volunteer observes things and collects the information. So that's data collection. I'm sure you'll have more questions related data collection because that's the most challenging piece. But I can definitely answer questions based on whatever we try. Analyzing data and using data are the most critical ones. But I've personally felt very, this can be challenging if you don't have data coming through on time. A lot of times what happens is by the time you get the data, and then you analyze the data and you give back reports, it's too late. And the turnaround time is very high. So by the time the person gets a report, it's already, probably like a month or month and a half later. So I think it's very important to think smartly. Sometimes what we do is we don't even, invest time in creating a dashboard for something that requires immediate action. So even something like a conditional formatting helps, right? So if you're able to open a sheet and see a bright color somewhere, then that catches your attention, and that is also enough for you to take an action. So it can be something as simple as that to, using tech to create dashboards. I think automating that process really reduces the turnaround time. Second, of course, technology helps, but technology and implementation of technology is another whole, task. And then instant feedback loop is another thing that really helps. And think about it, right? For all of us also, if you give a very low rating on your Ola ride and somebody gets in touch with you immediately in the next 1 hour, has a conversation with you and closes that loop, the chances of you giving a better, like you responding to that rating is higher. So it's very important when you're deciding what data points you collect. It's also important for you to see, can you give a report or an insight, or can you take an action on that data as soon as possible? So that increases the chances of people filling the data. These are some examples. So I think we are all, like, most of us are volunteering organizations. That's the reason why I put this specific screenshot. This is our VMS, or our volunteer management system. So based on the application flow and how we process it, it gives us insight. So it is a live dashboard. So it really helps us in having conversations and saying, hey, the screenshot is of last year. So we can talk about, here last year we took 48 days. Can we reduce it? That's why you can see our key result is to reduce the number of days as much as possible. We use a lot of tools in class. So the observations that we make in class, we instantly get a dashboard on our mobile application. Then we're immediately able to have that conversation and say, okay, were the volunteers prepared enough for class? Can we help them prepare better? So
can
such
you do it somehow? Not sure.
No, I don't think.
Can you read some text also? Because
yeah, so here it's nothing but the number of applications we've received and the number of applications we've filled, like positions we've filled. And here is, we use something called good things at the beginning of every class. We always try and share one good thing that happened with the student, or one good thing that happened with the volunteer. And this is an observation by a leader on how many times, or how effectively good thing as a tool was used in class. So these are some just. Not sure if you people can read this again. I'll read it out for people. This is, and I specifically put this screenshot because this is nothing but Google Sheets. So what we've done is we roll out feedback forms to our volunteers, and the feedback form response sheet is linked to Google has this tool. It's a free tool called Data Studio, and I think it's called Looker Studio now. So it's a free tool available. The learning curve is also quite less. It's easy to learn to build dashboards here. So we use this tool quite a bit to create dashboards for the feedback form. So the NPS image that you saw also is built from a Looker Studio. And here you can, I think the second screenshot, the first screenshot, you can see how what people think about the celebration, like the social media presence and interaction that they have. And this really helps us to take decisions when it comes to designing a recruitment campaign, or when we have to pick volunteers. Then how much we invest in a social media campaign, and in a city, say Bangalore has 70% of its current volunteers extremely active on social media, then running a social media campaign is something that Bangalore as a city or chapter can use as a strategy. So we're able to see these things through these dashboards. One other thing, an additional thing is, while creating the dashboard, right, a lot of times it takes some amount of skill to even read a graph. And to fill that gap, what we do is we sort of give options, like if this is the option with your highest rating, then this could be a potential insight. Okay? So we give that kind of a legend to help people understand what the data is talking about. Yeah, so any questions so far? Okay. So I think just talking through some constraints that we've faced, and feel free to also add on to the constraints, is lack of resources is one of the major things. Just in terms of skill wise, just in terms of the people who will be able to support with monitoring and evaluation and data skill in general, the kind of tech I personally haven't been able to find a tool that can help us with qualitative data analysis. Quantitative, you can still do, you have Power BI, you have SPSS, you have a lot of those things, but it still requires some amount of skill to do qualitative data analysis. I'm sure, like we've seen this, the data is not a priority, like especially for our volunteers. They're here to like teach or mentor, but the collecting data is really not a priority. Resistance to change is also quite a bit, especially I think if we're trying to change the platforms or move to more advanced tech, then there is that sudden sense of, yeah, I don't want to use this new. I mean, the biggest struggle I've seen in UNI and in other organizations is to move out of Google Sheets is a very difficult. I think low tool adoption is also like a thing that, and I can elaborate on these things if you have specific questions. Just going through this quickly because of time. And data quality. Sometimes even if we do get data, but there are errors in that data, it kind of gets very difficult in a volunteering program to go and get the change, like the data rectified. So these are some of the challenges that we face. Do write the challenges that you face. Now we do sort of keep these constraints and these challenges in mind, and there's some things that some values and some mindsets that we have while to make sure that we are able to overcome these challenges while collecting data and while doing M&E. And one of the things I think is a very important factor is the behavior of using data is very different, or it's separate from the tool adoption itself. And the analogy I'd like to use is, it's like learning to drive a car, right? If you learn to drive a car, that is the behavior of, or a skill of using, driving a car. But if you keep changing your car, that's still okay. There's a little bit of learning curve. If you go from a geared vehicle to an automatic car, there is some amount of skill, or one car might have, features different from another car. But if you know driving, then it's still easier for you to switch cars. So a lot of times, and this is like a mistake that we've also done in the past, where we try to combine the two and say adopt to a tool and create the habit of collecting and using data together at the same time. And that can be difficult. So just keeping that in mind has helped. Second thing is, I think, which is a more like very important thing, is collecting data that the stakeholder can use. So what we do is, if a volunteer is collecting data, then the volunteer should only collect the data that the volunteer can use. But the same data point can be used by other stakeholders in a different way, in a more robust way, complicated way, that's fine. But it gets very difficult if you're expecting stakeholders to collect data that they cannot use, right? Like from our volunteers, we collect attendance, we collect assessments from our volunteers. And these two data points, and we have something called a class book, which is a platform or a sheet where they put down how they planned for class and what they did in class. Now that really helps, and these are the only three data points that a volunteer collects, and it really helps them because they can use to improve class based on this data. So that is important. Second thing is, incorporating data collection into program design is very essential. So your program cannot be very different from the list of data points that you want to collect. It has to talk to each other and it has to be integrated for it to actually work. Incentivizing data, we've seen that really helps. And it's not just about, creating, just say the person with the most amount of data wins. It's not that, but really incentivizing the usage of data also really helps. If you've collected data, you've used that data, you've gone into insights and you've changed the way you function and made it better, then you deserve a recognition for it. And we do this quite well in UNI through our annual awards. And so if you see how we create, and we call it the outstanding communities of change, but how we do it is throughout the year, we do collect quantitative and qualitative data, but tagged to goals. And depending on the extent to which the goals were met and how innovative centers were, how innovative communities were, how engaged they were, depending on all these, different parameters, we have at the end of the year the awards where we recognize people. And I think the final thing is, I think just to uh, end this piece is, I think a lot of times we get pressurized into thinking we need to collect data, analyze data to create a report, either for a donor or a CSR partner or another organization or a partner of our annual reports. That is true, but I think the whole primary motive of M&E or monitoring and evaluating the program is to learn how to better the program and learn how to make it more effective. So that's what I was. We can go into questions, Meera.
Thanks, Yashaswini. We'll look at the questions in the chat. Before that, I think I'll just take some advantage that I'm hosting the session, so I'll ask some questions to begin with. So how do you, so to assess a volunteer's experience, right? Somebody who's, what if somebody is not marking the attendance very well? What are some questions or metrics that you ask your volunteers, not about the beneficiaries, but their own experience volunteering at UNI?
So if I get your question right, is how do we track their experience as a volunteer? Is that what you're
Yes.
So in a few ways, so for building a community, we use our debrief spaces. So which is like post class, people stay back to your sharing and they do debriefs. So in the walkthrough, right, the walkthrough that I'm referring to is an observational tool that the leaders use. So a bunch of volunteers together have a leader and who's also a volunteer, but who's been in the system for a while. Now, the leader sort of takes accountability to make sure the volunteers are engaged. And depending on how engaged they are, the walkthrough has a few questions based on how engaging the debrief was, how engaged were the volunteers, were they able to talk to each other, were they able to peer share better. So walkthrough is an example of one place where we collect data on volunteer engagement.
Right. Looking at the chat for some questions. And do you have any inputs on? I know that you mentioned that one of the demerits or one of the challenges that you face is assessing qualitative data. But I also think that when you put in a metric like on a scale of 1 to 5, how did you like the experience? People are also likely to forge answers. Like if I ask people now to how do you like the session, because it's visible, because they know who is answering, maybe a lot of people will rank it higher, and the data may not be very authentic. How do you check the authenticity of the data, or is that not a M&E parameter?
So I think two things to what you're asking. One is with qualitative data, it gets very difficult to check the authenticity of data because it has a lot to do with feelings, right, and behaviors and attitudes. So if you're feeling that the volunteer engagement was 5 out of 10, then I cannot dispute it and say, I don't think it was a 5, I think it's a 10. So that's one aspect, and that's part of it. I think very technically thinking about it, when you do report impact, you need to take an error percentage. So like human error percentage, either like, depending on the size of your survey, you can figure out this is the percentage I'm going to take an error. That's very technical. But even without that, I think authenticity can also be derived by collecting data from multiple sources. So for example, if volunteer engagement is what we're trying to measure, then we can measure volunteer engagement from 2-3 different areas or through 2-3 different sources. One is the number of hours the volunteer has spent with us. That is a more quantitative way of measuring, how engaged or how many hours they spent with us. Second, a more qualitative one would be asking a question like, how satisfied were you with the experience? Third thing you could also do is both stakeholders, right? Like 2 or 3 stakeholders. A facilitator also does a rating and the volunteer also does a rating. So if you are able to take data from 2, 3 spaces, then you more or less get a accurate, at least close to accurate.
Right. If more people have more questions, please feel free to unmute and ask or put them in chat. Yeah, can you? How do you attract more volunteers, and what are the websites or social media platforms to advertise for volunteering? I think this is a question more around recruitment that somebody from the UNI team may be able to answer,
Yeah.
Ruby. Moving to next question on, can you share your experience with designing qualitative indicators like for life scale or behavior changes?
Yeah, so I think that's an area that we're all trying to explore. We've used, especially with life skills and behavior changes, the only way to measure it is through observations or through experiential learning methods. So what we attempt to do is try to do a combination of both. So on like during an academic year, with life skills, we try to do a beginning of the year assessment where we have a rubrics, and rubrics really helps in your qualitative assessments. So if you have a rubrics, then it's easier to standardize the assessment for like at a scale. So say for example, life skills, then we have certain parameters like critical thinking. How do they get along with each other? That could be another parameter. How participative are they? So that can give you a little bit of confidence and self-expression. So these are 3, 4, parameters you can take for life skills, and then make observations. Now to enable observations also, we do something like we give role play activities, or we give situational activities for them to do, and then we observe them at the beginning of the year and towards the end of the year, and then we measure change. So that's one way we do life skills. We also give project work to check how life skills happen.
Right.
I hope I've answered your.
Yeah. There's one more question around. So, although UNI does it for a more long-term systematic program, how can people who do short-term, one-time activities track their? How can they monitor their progress? What are some indicators that you think short-term volunteering programs can use?
Yeah, so I think the term really does give you, like if it's a long-term program, then it helps you collect data at different frequency. That's the only advantage. But when you are running a short-term volunteering program, you are still sort of collecting the same whatever you've set as an objective. If your short-term volunteering is for, say, corporate volunteers to gain exposure, then that's your goal, and you will need to, put down certain, indicators that you can measure. Maybe when in a short-term volunteering sprint, then the number of data points you collect can be very less, right? But also it's important to think about, like, 2 things might be really helpful there. One is the number of hours they spend, and second is their feedback, their experience. So you can balance between quantitative and qualitative. The logic of M&E still remains the same, but the frequency will just reduce.
Right, thanks. Amit is asking if we have any pro bono tools available to do M&E or record this data, if I'm interpreting the question right, Amit. One you mentioned, I think, Data Studio.
Yeah. So I think I can share a list of tools with Megha, and she can put it on the WhatsApp group. But pro bono usually are, your Google Suite, Looker Studio, a few of these. But otherwise, what we've also seen in our experience is if you're not for profit and you write to tools, right? Write to people. Like we use Airtable, we use Monday.com, we use a lot of these tech tools. You can still write to them and you get a non-profit discount. So you can always reach out.
Right. Prabhakaran here is asking, anything else one can do to increase adoption of tools for volunteers to share core data like classroom or
Yeah.
event attendance or impact of the data of the events or the
Yeah.
projects that they're doing?
Yeah. So I think one thing that has really helped us is really breaking down the size of volunteer is to leader ratio. So we follow something called learning circles. So we try to map one leader. Basically, leader is the person who holds people accountable, who guides people, who builds a relationship with people and builds a community. So one leader will at the most have 7 to 10 volunteers to handle. So that decreasing that size really helps, because it's as simple as this, right? Like I have a relationship with you, and I have spent time guiding you to do a better program and training you. I know you well, and I come and ask you for data. Your chances of you giving me data is a lot more higher, and the chances of both of us using that data to take a decision is also a lot more higher than it will be if it's at a scale and I don't know you, I don't have that connection, but I still ask you for data. Then there's a chance that you wouldn't, right? I mean, just think of it like if you've really had a good conversation with your Ola driver, there's a high chance you will fill that rating. Than
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
it's
We've
just
given
that.
several times, we've given five ratings,
Yeah.
although I don't like the car, but yeah. So
Yeah.
there's another question that he's asked. I'm not sure if I'm getting it right. Is that if there are any bright spots or any sweet spots on where data that's been used can positive competition, can driving that positive competition actually motivate volunteers to fill in more data? Prabhakar, I'm not sure if I'm asking the right question. Please add if I'm not answering the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely helps. It's a very strong way of creating recognition. Um, I mean, it is natural, right? If you're being able to justify why you're recognizing a person also. And data helps you do that. You're just not saying, I think you're a good volunteer, but you're also saying, I think you're a good volunteer because you have 80% attendance. You have used one creative teaching technique in every class, and you have, been able to help the other volunteers. And we've noticed this, we've recorded this. You can even say, if you are able to record data, then you can even say that 7 out of 10 classes your student really liked the class, if you're even collecting student feedback for class. So that really helps, and you can imagine that is a great motivation factor. We in fact use it in our centers. We call it teacher of the month. So we do run this thing wherein centers recognize a teacher every month, and there are certain parameters decided at the beginning of the year and shared with all the volunteers. So it does really help.
Yeah, but so there's the next question that I was also going to ask, that this closely analyzing a volunteer or this data collection happening at a consistent level, maybe for somebody who's doing it full time or like an M&E person like you. But if smaller organizations who are maybe working with say 30-40 volunteers at a time, if one person is working at it, and we also have organization that works at a larger scale of volunteers with not a 1:1 ratio, how do they do it? How do they motivate the volunteers? How do they analyze this data or collect it?
So I'm sure like if you are organizations like that, it'll be good if you can also share. But I think when the organization is more smaller, then it gets it's easier to have more touch points. That's the simple thing. A lot of times I've seen where we struggle is, and even when I was smaller, is we try to collect all the data possible, and that does not help. If you have a list of say 25 data points and you sit with a person and say, okay, what was this, what was this, what was this, what was this, that really doesn't help. That's why it's important to include data in program design. So it's good to layer it and integrate it with the program and not really, make it a separate thing. I feel like that sort of really helps. If it's a program that is larger than us, even at the scale that we are working today, it is not just the monitoring and evaluation department or just me analyzing and supporting with data collection. Actually, we do the designing bit. The implementation of the data collection is done by the implementation team, even to a volunteer level. So really, while designing M&E, it's very important that you design it keeping every stakeholder in mind and not design it from the lens of, okay, I am an M&E person with this department, I need XYZ thing, so give it to me. I don't think that works. It has to be, and going back to the point where it has to be, can the stakeholder use the data they collect? And that's very important. So even while we are scaling and we are figuring out how to do that well, we are sort of going back to, can we make it as lean as possible? Can we make it as usable as possible? You might not be able to collect 120 data points. You might be able to collect only 10. But using 10 really well is better than collecting 120 and not using any of it. So I would say that.
Yes, I put a feedback form in the chat box. If people who can please fill in the feedback form. This also allows you to join our EIV WhatsApp group. This helps us curate sessions better. And Yashaswini, in your talk, you were also talking about how less is more. And I remember when we were talking yesterday, you mentioned how in your first M&E program, when you joined in, maybe you collected too much data and nobody filled in the data. I remember. And when you say let's collect all the data that we can, and then there is less is more. So if you could find a sweet spot for us, or how much less is less and how much less is more?
I think the least you can get is better. But I can give you an example if that helps. I'm using similar examples so that we are all understanding it. Like volunteer attendance, I'm not even saying attendance of students, but volunteer attendance really helps us. It's one data point that is recorded, but that one data point really helps us in a lot of ways, right? One is, it's like when we analyze it, we create trends, then we're able to see if a volunteer has a specific trend in being absent, right? What is the consistency of that volunteers attendance? So a lot of times we do see patterns, like there'll be a person who will attend all the Saturdays but miss every third Saturday, every fourth Saturday. Then it helps us address that issue. Second is when we are able to the same data point, right, which is volunteer attendance, we're able to analyze that. We're also able to see a trend in a year also. And we face this wherein during exam times, then attendance really drops. So it really helps us to even have volunteers who are working and have a good balance between working volunteers and studying volunteers, so that when college students have exams, the center doesn't stop working. So it's the same data point that can be used. But what are we collecting? We're collecting only attendance data, but we use it in many ways.
Right, thanks. So what I also think is that this data that we collect also helps us set goals for our next year, right? Can you quote an example on? So I think sometimes we expect like a very higher goal, and then when we look at our results, then for a webinar, we see that 200 people register, but when we see that these many people only show up, we start setting up goals differently. For our volunteer recruitment, we see like 500 people have applied for our program, but only like maybe a 10 or 20% of them actually completed or continue to become our volunteer leaders next year. How do you use that data in setting your next goals, or how has this data helped you in improving your programs?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it has, because um, basically what trends do, especially data trends do, is they turn into insight. And once you start, get into the habit of looking at insights and data, it turns into wisdom. Like basically, you don't have to really spend so much time into things. It becomes intuitive, right? So the more data you use, you sort of reach that space where you're able to use that a lot better than you did. I think all over the years we have used the volunteer selection recruitment, data in a lot of various ways. I think one example I can think of is just the feedback form question that we have, which is what was your recruitment experience as a volunteer, really helps us in designing the key result for the next year. So one of the key things that we saw in the last, academic year is a turnaround time between a person applying to being screened and then the interview process and then placed was quite a bit. Like it took a few days. So maybe that could be, like we realized, maybe that could be one of the reasons why people drop out of the process, just the length of the process. So one decision we took, and you can see in one of the goal screenshot I shared, was one of the key results that we are aiming at is to reduce the turnaround time, or the reduce the time taken between a person applying to getting placed as less as possible, even if it is as less as 10 working days, lesser than 10. So that's one decision we've taken to tweak our. The goal is still recruiting volunteers, but the key result that all of us in the org will try to achieve is the lesser turnaround. I think another really good insight we've gotten is when you're able to collect demographic details of volunteers, in the sense of what age group do most of your volunteers belong to, what college do they belong to, which city has a lot more volunteers coming through referrals. A lot of these insights really help, because then you're able to double down on that strategy. So it helps in creating strategy.
Right. Yeah. And in our team, we often discuss that when you identify these key indicators, what is working good, maybe you should double down on those. And something
Yeah.
that's not working, if you can completely avoid it, maybe stop doing it. So if you think your Instagram ads are not getting you good volunteers, which may not be true for a lot of people, then you stop spending money on your Instagram ads and maybe spend more on your LinkedIn ads, or maybe spend more effort on doing college recruitment per se, maybe. Yeah. Any other insights do you think, Yashaswini, if you had to say that these are 3 data points that every volunteering organization should collect, whether they do it or not? And then I have one more question for you. Sorry, I'm flooded with questions.
No problem. So I think must-haves are definitely engagement hours. Just the time that they spend. That's the quantitative parameter.
Number of hours that they spend.
Yeah, number of hours. Second is, if you can, in a way, check the quality of the engagement with the volunteer also. And that could be either how engaged they were, or were they able to, meet the goal of your volunteering. If it's say an environmental drive, then how involved were they? They might have spent 4 hours with you, but in that 4 hours, how engaged were they might be a parameter good to, collect. I think when it comes to maybe short-term volunteering programs, could be how recurring the volunteering is also important. Like if a person is volunteering with you over it, and I mean to say short-term volunteering programs like a cleanup drive, or um, teaching also, if it's for 1 weekend, 2 weekends, whatever, right? Then if it is something like that, or even if it is animal welfare related, then if there is a volunteer, signing up to volunteer repeatedly, then that's a good, metrics to use in a lot of ways. One is that shows how good your volunteering experiences. Second, it also helps you identify people you can, give more responsibility to or upskill more and contribute at a higher level. That could be one. For long-term volunteering, I think similar, which is quantity and quality. But long-term volunteering also, I think a lot of feedback. There's a lot of room for feedback that can be collected from volunteers. So that.
Thanks. Amit has also put in some factors in the chat, like type of activity or task, volunteer attendance, number of hours they've spent, gender, age group, and whether they're working or studying or not.
Demography really helps.
So one thing that I've been wanting to ask from the beginning is, so what if somebody has never done M&E and they've just been focusing a lot on how good an experience they're able to deliver to a volunteer, and may not have people who are very focused on data. Maybe they're just happy that so many people showed up and they were all very happy. And they may not have budget to recruit an M&E expert, or the team members are not very data focused. I'm including all the things that may not have. Then who do you think should be a person who do it? Should it be a program manager who's running these volunteers? What sort of a person do you bring in your organization to?
Yeah, I think that's a challenge all of us face. Even we face that. Yes, I haven't met any person who doesn't face that challenge. Even like, there's no like college where we can go learn M&E also. So, like, even for me, it is. I think there was a high need, right? And like as a volunteer in UNI, I did see that we do so much and we create so much impact. As a leader, I could see that we're innovating constantly, we're doing so much. But there was always that gap of, there's no way we're not documenting it enough, we are not measuring it enough. We are, and when you reach a point where you're able to do that, you're also able to share that with other people, other organizations. We're not able to do that enough. And that was sort of a motivation to go figure it out. And the go figuring it out really starts with a Google search. It's not something, drastically, requires some level of expertise. But I think it's just that core interest of trying to measure things. But most of the programs really started figuring out their intervention, figuring out their volunteer experience, their delivery model. It really is that. But what you're also parallelly trying to do is, and whoever is interested in your program, and it does help if that person knows the program in and out. And it really helps me because it's also a journey that we are all on. Even in UNI, it's a new, like relatively new concept, and we're trying to get better at it every year. But what really helps me personally is I'm able to think through different stakeholders because I've been in the system for a while. I've been a volunteer. I know what a volunteer's life looks like, a leader's life looks like, a manager's life looks like. So that's why it helps. So somebody with fair amount of context who's able to spend some time upskilling and exploring, and who has the intention to, start somewhere, figure it out, be resilient, I think should help. It really is not like, like really complicated, even though I think a lot of times it's the word data that scares everyone. But otherwise it's
I'm
fairly simple.
definitely that person.
Yeah.
So
The
there's a
numbers really scares everyone's math trauma in school.
Yeah, I don't know about others, but I absolutely don't like data. But I only like it when it's showing a good progress or trend.
That also, yeah.
Yeah, I think that when one question I have, then I have a question from Lavanya in the chat box. He said, so I am able to track that my numbers, my retention numbers, and my recruitment numbers are increasing. Or I know that maybe 20% of my volunteers actually complete the activity from the application. If 100 people apply, 20 people actually complete the activity. How do I know? My volunteering program can be very unique, and you may not have the exact answer to it also.
Yeah.
How do I know whether that 20% is a good number or not? I know there are a lot of people who may have opinions on this, whether 20% or a 10% is a good number or not. But if I start doing it, how do I measure the indicator whether it's good or not?
I think two things I would say. First of all, I'm not an expert at this specific question. It's not, we don't deal with this kind of volunteering. But what I would recommend is whether 20% is good or not really depends on what you have set as a target. And while setting a target, it is very important to get some, do a bit of research, talk to more organizations who are doing something similar or who have been doing this for longer. That really helps to have a baseline, just to have a reference point, to have a benchmark. And then if the benchmark, say in all the organizations that do similar things, and the benchmark is 50% engagement. Like, I think I can think of one example is Megha, when you said so many people have signed up, but 50 to 60 people will show up, and it's really we're hitting that number. So in a way, you have monitored and evaluated your attendance of people in the last few sessions, and you've arrived at that number, that conversion rate. So in your head, that's your baseline, right? And if we had exceeded 60 and we had hit 80 today or 90 today, you would have said, oh, we did a great job. But if we had done 20, 25, then you would have said it's not a very good turnout, right? So I think it's about having a baseline. I think our biggest struggle has been to get a baseline, because a lot of us are doing very unique programs. Getting a baseline might be difficult. Like, I've personally found it difficult to get baselines, but it helps to connect with other organizations.
Yes. So moving to Lavanya's question, I know that I asked my question, is that if the person who is designing the program is also collecting that data and is also doing the M&E, will it not dilute, or how authentic will it remain? I think that's what your question is, Lavanya. Please feel free to unmute and ask it now. Yeah.
Hey, yes, thank you, Megha. So, hi, Yashu. So the question is what Megha said, but it's so for quantitative, like if you're talking about your basic literacy, you can always take the exam results or test results and all of this. But when we're looking at qualitative data that we're trying to collect, if the person who's delivering the content is the same who's also going to be collecting the M&E, I'm just questioning the authenticity of the data that's collected. And I'm also wondering how we can collect that data from other sources. Like with recruitment, you still can do it when it's the volunteers, but when it's the youth and the children, I'm just thinking about how we could do that.
Right. So one practice that we do, especially when we collect student feedback, and student feedback is a relatively tricky area, so which we are also trying to explore. Two things I would say is, one, while designing the feedback form, it becomes very important that you make sure that you're keeping this possibility in mind. And I'll give you an example. When we are putting questions in the feedback form, if we directly say, did your teacher, do you like your teacher? Then it's obvious if the teacher is in front of the student or anywhere around, or even not around, the student might say, yes, I love my teacher. Or might say, I don't like my teacher, just to annoy the teacher. And we have those naughty things. But I think that's where design plays a more important role. It's important to identify what are you trying to understand. So we ask them certain questions like, did you like the activities? So we're separating the person here, and we're saying, did you like the activities that happened in class? Right? And it's not a yes or no question. We use it with students. We use a lot of emoticons, so they're able to associate emotions and feelings with the emoticon. So you have a grumpy option, you have a sad option, happy option, you have the face with the star option. So it's still a 5-point Likert scale, but converted into emoticons. That's one way that helps with students. Second is, when you are asking about an activity, you can also ask about certain qualitative aspects of that activity. So, did you find the activity challenging enough? And I have been very surprised when we have asked this question to our students. A lot of them, and mostly students are very candid about these things. So they do say, no, it was very easy for me. So then you know that you need to increase the challenge in that activity. So I think in terms of design, it's important again to know what do you want for feedback, what do you exactly want, and then figure out maybe one or two questions to ask about that. Second, different ways of asking it. I think for volunteers, what we do is our feedback form is never a Likert scale. Our feedback form is never rate between 0 if you strongly agree to strongly disagree. It's never that. Most of our options are descriptive. So one example is the social media screenshot that I shared. Right? How engaged are you with social media? Your one option is what normally people do is on a scale of 1 to 10, you pick a number. But what we do is we give them 4 to 5 options, ranging from I do not use social media, I don't like it, I'm not part of anything, to I love social media, I engage with you and I post quite a bit and I really like the UNI media page. Right? So, and then in between we give more options. Like I am active on social media, but I don't like UNI's social media page is also an option. So we do give descriptive statements like that, and I've seen that it works better. Second thing is specifically what you asked is, when we do give out feedback forms, we make sure that the person who is directly involved in that person's journey is not the person giving it. A lot of times, the volunteer feedback form is a link, right, that is shared with context as a group. With students, what we do is, it's not the volunteer who has taught taking feedback, it is the leader of that learning circle taking. And with students, because it's a lot more tricky, the leader is also able to ask more questions and dig deeper. So if the student says, no, the activity was very easy, then the leader will say, okay, why was it easy? So we sort of have a conversation with the student. With volunteers, not necessary to have a conversation, but roll it out in a group. I hope that I answered your question.
Yes, thanks a lot, Yashu.
Megha, you are not audible.
Sorry, thanks. Whoever unmuted me, thank you so much. So thanks so much. I think we would like to wrap up the session now. I would also want to announce that our next webinar that we are planning is around how can NGOs get corporates to give them money for corporate volunteering activities. I know a lot of NGOs who are still not engaging corporate volunteers and would want to do that. And even if they're doing, they don't know how to charge money for that. So we're inviting the Good Era's Director of Volunteering, Neha Srivastava, for that. Stay tuned for that. Please fill in your feedback form so we can send you more updates on that.